The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the salt spray that misted her cottage windows and in the damp stones of her floor. Alara knew the cold intimately. She knew it better than she knew herself these days. Her own body was a stranger, a vessel that had grown sluggish and weary, prone to bouts of nausea that she blamed on the brackish water from her well, and fatigue that she attributed to the long, dark season. She, the best midwife on the outer isles, could not diagnose the simple ailment that plagued her own flesh. It was a failure she added to a long list of others she kept locked away, deep in the part of her that no longer saw the sun. She had been a warrior once. Her hands, now so skilled at easing life into the world, had been trained to take it. They had known the jarring shock of a sword striking a shield, the balanced weight of a battle axe. Now they only knew the feel of rough-spun blankets and the slippery warmth of a newborn. It was a penance. A quiet, lonely atonement on a forgotten scrap of rock at the edge of the Alpha King's vast island dominion. This morning, the cold was different. It was a predatory thing, a stillness in the pre-dawn air that held no promise of sunrise. A storm was coming. She felt it in the ache of old bones, old wounds. A sound broke the quiet. Not the cry of gulls or the crash of waves. It was the heavy scrabble of claws on stone. Something large was outside her door. Panic, a cold and familiar serpent uncoiled in her gut. She was a woman alone. Her past had been violent enough to teach her that being a woman alone was a dangerous thing. Her hand instinctively went to the hearth, to the heavy iron poker resting there. A pitiful weapon, but a weapon nonetheless. The old instincts, the ones she tried to starve, were awake and screaming. The scratching stopped. It was replaced by a low, guttural whine that vibrated through the thick wood of her door. It was not the sound of a man. It was the sound of a beast. A wolf. There were no wolves on this isle. Not true wolves. They were creatures of the mainland, of the Alpha King's personal domain. To see one here was impossible. The whine came again, more insistent this time. It was not a sound of aggression. It was a sound of summons, a command. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She did not move. She barely breathed. Perhaps it would go away. A heavy thump rattled the door in its frame. Then another. The beast was not asking. She tightened her grip on the poker, the cold iron a small comfort. She was not the girl who had been broken. She was not the warrior who had fled. She was a midwife, a healer. But the shadows of those other women lived inside her still. Slowly, she moved to the door, her bare feet silent on the cold stones. She peered through a tiny crack in the wood, a splintered hole that let in a sliver of the gray dawn. An eye stared back. It was not the eye of any wolf she had ever seen in a book or a tapestry. It was a piece of the winter sky, a pale, piercing ice blue that seemed to glow with its own internal light. It saw her. It knew she was there. The beast huffed, a plume of hot breath misting the wood around the crack. And then it did something that shattered her reality. It spoke, though not with a voice. A single word, impressed directly into her mind, clear as a bell. Come. The mental command was so absolute, so powerful, that her knees nearly buckled. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. You will come. Her hand trembled, the poker suddenly feeling foolish and small. This was not some wild animal. This was something else. Something of the Alpha King. With a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Alara slid the bolt. The door creaked open. The creature that stood on her threshold stole the air from her lungs. It was a wolf. Yes, but to call it a wolf was to call a hurricane a summer breeze. It was monstrously large, its shoulders as high as her waist, its fur a shifting tapestry of charcoal and silver. Its ice-blue eyes were fixed on her, and in them she saw an intelligence that was terrifyingly ancient. This was no mere beast. This was a king's envoy. It took a step back, a clear invitation. Then it lowered its massive head and gently, so gently, took the sleeve of her tunic in its jaws. The pressure was firm, unyielding. It did not tear the fabric. It did not mark her skin. It simply began to pull. The wolf dragged the midwife from her door at dawn. It pulled her out into the biting wind, across the damp earth of her garden, and toward the churning gray sea. She did not fight. Fighting was pointless. You did not fight the tide. You did not fight the winter. And you did not fight a creature that carried the will of the Alpha King in its eyes. At the cove, a longship waited, its dark wood stark against the foam. Men in the king's livery stood at attention, their faces grim, their eyes never once meeting the gaze of the great wolf. They saw Alara, a lone woman in a simple tunic, being towed by the beast, and their expressions did not flicker. This was expected. This was ordained. The wolf led her up the gangplank. Its jaws never loosened their grip. Her feet stumbled on the wood, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. The nausea from the morning returned with a vengeance. She pressed a hand to her stomach, a reflexive, protective gesture. The wolf stopped. It released her sleeve and nudged her hand with its cold, wet nose. For a fleeting moment, the ice in its eyes seemed to soften, to hold a flicker of something that was not command, but concern. Then the moment passed. The command returned to its gaze, and it nudged her forward, toward the stern of the ship. The journey was a blur of gray sea and gray sky. Ilara huddled in a thick, oiled cloak one of the men had given her, the wool smelling of lanolin and smoke. No one spoke to her. The wolf lay at her feet, its massive head resting on its paws, but its eyes never closed. They watched her. Why her? The question was a frantic drumbeat in her mind, a midwife from the Forgotten Isle. What could the Alpha King, the ruler of 100 islands and 1,000 jagged cliffs, possibly want with her? Was this a punishment? Had her past finally caught up with her? As the hours passed, a new shape emerged from the mist. An island unlike any she had ever seen. It was a single, colossal mountain of black rock that clawed its way out of the sea, its peak shrouded in a permanent storm cloud. A fortress was carved into its face, not built upon it, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the endless ocean. The king's seat. It was a place of legend, a place of power and fear, and she was being dragged to its heart. The longship docked in a cavernous sea cave at the mountain's base. The air grew colder still, the dampness seeping into her bones. The wolf was on its feet before the ship was fully moored, its presence filling the echoing space. It nudged her again. Time to go. They led her up winding stairs carved from the living rock, past guards who stood like statues of stone, their faces hidden behind grim helms. The silence was absolute, broken only by the click of the wolf's claws and the frantic, terrified thumping of her own heart. The sheer scale of the place was meant to intimidate, to crush. Every archway was impossibly high, every corridor a chasm. It was a fortress built for giants, for gods, not for men. And certainly not for a small, trembling midwife. Finally, they stopped before a set of doors wrought from black iron, inlaid with veins of silver that seemed to writhe and twist like captured lightning. The wolf pushed one of the doors open with its snout and ushered her inside. The room was a throne room, but it held no throne. Instead, a massive, unadorned chair of black stone sat on a simple dais at the far end. The chamber was lit only by high, narrow windows and by a cold, blue-white light that emanated from the stone of the walls themselves. It was a tomb. A grand, beautiful, and utterly lifeless tomb. A man stood by one of the windows, his back to her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence a heavy weight that seemed to suck the very air from the room. He wore simple black clothes, no crown, no finery. He did not need them. Power rolled off him in waves, a palpable force that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. This was the Alpha King, Kalen. The great wolf padded silently to his side and sat, Its duty done, the king turned. Ilara had expected a monster, a brute. The stories told of his ruthlessness, his cold fury, were whispered on every aisle. The man who turned to face her was not a monster. He was something far more dangerous. He was beautiful. His beauty was that of a glacier, harsh, sharp, and ancient. His hair was the color of midnight, his face a collection of sharp angles and stark planes. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the same impossible ice blue as his wolf's, but where the wolves held intelligence, the king's held a desolate, endless winter. It was the gaze of a man who had not felt warmth in centuries. He looked at her, and it felt like being weighed, measured, and found wanting in the space of a single heartbeat. His gaze was heavy, analytical. It missed nothing. "You are the midwife," he said. His voice was deep, like the grinding of stones at the bottom of the sea. It was not a question. "I am, Your Majesty," she whispered, her own voice sounding thin and weak in the vast, cold room. She forced herself to dip into a curtsy, an awkward, clumsy movement. He ignored it. His eyes raked over her, from her tangled hair to the hem of her simple tunic. "My wolf chose you. Fenrir has not chosen anyone for anything in 200 years. He has a better sense for these things than I do." Ilara remained silent. What could she say? He took a step toward her, and she had to fight the instinct to flinch back. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and deliberate. He stopped just out of arm's reach. The air around him was cold, not just the ambient chill of the room, but a personal, radiating coldness that seemed to emanate from his very skin. "The women of my court are useless," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They are preening birds, concerned with silks and status. They know nothing of life, or of death." His icy gaze sharpened. "You do. You live at the edge of it every day." She thought of the warrior she had been. She thought of the blood on her hands, the lives she had taken. The irony was a bitter pill in her throat. "I help bring life, Your Majesty. That is all." A flicker of something. Was it amusement? Contempt? Passed through his eyes. "Do you? Then perhaps you can help preserve it." He held out his hand. For a moment she just stared at it. It was a large hand, scarred and calloused, a warrior's hand. But it was the skin that shocked her. It was pale, unnaturally so, and a fine crystalline frost seemed to glitter on the back of it, even in the dim light. "I am unwell," he said, the admission sounding like it was torn from him, a concession of weakness he despised. "There is a sickness in my line, a cold that settles in the blood. The court physicians offer platitudes and potions that do nothing." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "Fenrir smelled the truth on you. He brought you to me. Now, you will tell me what you see." This was the test. She knew it. Her life, her freedom, it all balanced on this moment. She was a midwife, not a physician, but she was also a survivor. Taking a ragged breath, she stepped forward. Her hand, small and trembling, reached out to his. The moment her fingers brushed his skin, she gasped. It was cold. Not the cold of a winter morning or a damp stone. It was a profound, absolute, deathly cold. It was the cold of a tomb, the cold of a starless void. It was a cold that didn't just lack heat, it actively consumed it. She felt the warmth drain from her own fingertips, sucked away into the chilling abyss of his flesh. But beneath the cold, there was something else. A flicker. A tiny, struggling ember of life, banked so low it was almost imperceptible. And woven through it all, a tracery of dark, malevolent magic, as intricate and as deadly as a spider's web. It was a curse, an ancient and powerful one. She pulled her hand back as if burned, though the sensation was the exact opposite. She cradled her fingers, trying to chafe the life back into them. "Well?" His voice was sharp, impatient. She looked up, meeting his frozen gaze. The warrior in her told her to lie, to feign ignorance, to run. The midwife in her, the healer, saw a man in profound pain, and the woman saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. "That is not a sickness, Your Majesty," she said, her voice steadier now. "It is a curse, and it is killing you." For the first time since she entered the room, the Alpha King's composure broke. A fissure of raw shock cracked his icy facade. He had expected a diagnosis, not a damnation. He knew. Of course he knew. But to hear it spoken so plainly, by a stranger, a simple midwife, it had struck a blow he hadn't anticipated. The silence that followed was heavier than any before it. The king stared at her, his glacial eyes searching her face for deceit, for ambition, for fear. He found only a weary honesty. He was the first to look away. He turned back to the window, presenting her with his formidable back once more. "You will stay," he commanded, his voice muffled. "You will have quarters. You will have whatever you need. You will not speak of this to anyone." He paused. "And you will find a way to fight it." It was not a request. It was the desperate order of a drowning man. And so Alara, the fugitive warrior turned lonely midwife, became the secret healer to a dying, cursed king. Her life, which had become so small and quiet, was now tied to the fate of the most powerful man in the Isles. Her quarters were opulent, a stark contrast to her simple cottage. Silken sheets, a fire that never went out, and meals brought on silver trays. It was a luxurious prison. She was not allowed to leave the inner sanctum of the keep. The great wolf, Fenrir, was her constant shadow, a silent, watchful jailer. Her days fell into a new rhythm. Every morning she would go to the king. She would take his pulse, her fingers growing more accustomed to the life-draining cold. She prepared herbal infusions, not with any real hope of curing him, but to soothe the symptoms. The curse manifested as a deep, aching pain in his bones and a profound exhaustion that he hid from his court behind a mask of ruthless efficiency. She was the only one who saw the mask slip. In their sessions, he was not a king and she was not a subject. They were two damaged people in a cold stone room, fighting a battle against an unseen enemy. He spoke little of himself, but she learned to read him in the tense set of his jaw, the flicker of pain in his eyes, the way his hands would clench into fists when a wave of cold washed over him. She, in turn, revealed nothing of her past. He did not ask. He seemed to respect the walls she had built around herself, perhaps because they mirrored his own. Intimacy grew in the quiet spaces. It grew in the way he would allow her to wrap his frigid hands in warmed cloths, his silent acceptance of her care a more profound trust than any words. It grew when she would read to him from old texts on healing, her voice a low murmur in the quiet room as he lay on a chaise, his eyes closed, conserving his strength. One evening, he was worse than she had ever seen him. The frost was no longer just on his skin. It was creeping up the sleeves of his tunic. Tiny, perfect crystals of ice forming on the black fabric. His breathing was shallow. She worked frantically, plying him with a potent, warming brew of ginger and cinnamon bark. She sat by his side, her own small hands wrapped around one of his, trying to force her own meager warmth into his frozen flesh. "It's getting stronger," he rasped, his voice thin. His eyes were closed. "We will fight it," she said, her own words sounding hollow. He gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "I have been fighting it for 300 years, midwife. It was placed on my ancestor, the first king of the Isles. No one in my line has ever known the warmth of a lover's touch without paying this price. To feel affection, to care, to love, is to invite death. The cold feeds on it." His confession hung in the air between them, a curse that fed on love, the ultimate cruelty for an alpha whose entire being was wired for a mate, for a bond. "Why?" she whispered. "My ancestor spurned a witch," he said, his voice weary with the weight of generations. "She promised that his line would rule, but they would rule alone. that any love they felt would turn to ice in their veins. He opened his eyes, the pale blue irises stark against the pained flush on his cheeks. I am the last of my line. When I die, the curse dies with me. Perhaps that is for the best. No, she said, the word sharp, surprising them both. It is not for the best. To surrender is not a victory. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for a moment the king was gone. There was only Kaelin, a man trapped in an impossible, lonely existence. You sound like a warrior, midwife, he murmured. The comment struck her like a physical blow. She pulled her hands back, her mask of calm composure cracking. I am a healer. Are you? He pushed himself up on one elbow, his gaze intense. I have seen you. You do not walk like a midwife. You are too aware of your surroundings. You assess every room, every person. You stand as if you are ready to receive a blow. That is not a healer's posture. That is a soldier's. Her blood ran cold. He saw too much. My past is my own, she said, her voice tight. As is mine, he countered softly. He reached out, his frosted fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was so cold it burned, but it was not unkind. Whatever you were, Alara, whatever you fled from, you are here now. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded right in his deep voice. It sounded like she belonged. The moment stretched, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with curses or kings. It was the simple, terrifying tension between a man and a woman. She didn't know who moved first. She didn't care. His lips met hers, and it was a collision of ice and fire. His mouth was as cold as his skin, a shocking, breathtaking cold. But she did not pull away. She met his coldness with the flickering warmth of her own life, a desperate, defiant act. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of shared desperation, of two lonely souls clinging to each other in the dark. It was raw and hungry and deeply, deeply sad. And in the middle of it, a confession, spoken against her lips. So quiet it was more a feeling than a sound. I love you. She wasn't sure who had said it. Him. Her. Maybe both of them at once. The thought echoed in the chambers of her heart, a truth she hadn't dared to acknowledge. The words, meant to be a balm, were a poison. He cried out, a sharp, strangled sound, and shoved himself away from her. He collapsed back against the chaise, his body convulsing. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The frost on his tunic spread like wildfire, encasing his arms in sheaths of ice. His breath plumed in the air, thick and white. The very temperature of the room plummeted. Kaelin! She cried, scrambling toward him. Get back! He roared, his voice hoarse with agony. He curled into a ball, his powerful frame racked with shudders. A layer of rime was spreading across his face, catching in his dark hair, turning it silver. The curse. It heard. The love confession, the single moment of honest connection, had been a death sentence. It had given the curse the one thing it craved. It had given it a feast. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This was her fault. Her presence, her care, their shared moment of weakness. It was killing him. The next few days were a waking nightmare. Kaelin was consumed by the icy curse. He was moved to his private chambers, and the court physicians, a gaggle of fussy, useless men, barred her from seeing him. They whispered that the strange midwife from the outer isles had poisoned him, that her wild magic had aggravated his chill. She was confined to her rooms again, but this time it was not a gilded cage. It was a true prison. The guards outside her door were hostile, their eyes filled with suspicion. Fenrir was gone, likely by his master's side. She was alone, trapped, and desperate. The king was dying, and she was the cause. The thought was a constant, tormenting refrain. She paced her room like a caged animal, her warrior instinct screaming at her to find a way out, to do something. It was during one of these frantic, sleepless nights that the other truth finally made itself known. The nausea, the fatigue, the strange sluggishness of her own body. It wasn't an ailment. She was standing by the window staring out at the storm-racked sky when a sudden sharp pain lanced through her lower belly. It was not the pain of sickness. It was a flutter, a movement, life. She froze, her hand flying to her abdomen. She pressed down, her midwife's fingers, so skilled on others, now fumbling and uncertain on her own flesh. There, again. A definite, undeniable quickening. She was pregnant. The realization didn't bring joy. It brought a tidal wave of ice-cold terror that dwarfed even the king's curse. How? When? The timeline was a blur of trauma and flight. It had to have been from before, from the life she had escaped. A final parting wound from a past she thought she had buried. A midwife who didn't know she carried a child. A healer who could not heal herself. The irony was so bitter it made her want to scream. But the warrior in her took over. A child. A reason to live. A reason to fight. She could not save the king, but she had to save this new life. Her life. She had to escape. Her chance came 3 nights later. A shift in the guard. A moment of distraction. She used a trick she hadn't used in years. A way of moving through shadows that had been second nature to her once. She was a ghost in the halls of the king's seat. She didn't run for the sea caves. She ran for the royal chambers. She had to see him. One last time. She had to know. She found his room unguarded. A bad sign. The physicians had likely given up. The chamber was arctic. Ice slicked the floors and climbed the walls in great feathered patterns. In the center of the room, on a massive bed, lay the king. He was almost entirely encased in ice. It was a crystalline cocoon, beautiful and terrible. Only his face was partially free, his skin the color of blue-white marble, his lips purple. He was barely breathing. But he was not alone. A woman stood by the bed, her back to the door. She was tall and unnaturally thin, wrapped in shadows that seemed to cling to her like a cloak. She hummed a low, discordant tune as she ran a long, skeletal finger along the ice covering Kaylin's chest. "So close!" the woman hissed, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. So close to finishing the line, this one was so stubborn, but he finally found something to love, and that, my dear boy, is your undoing. Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, who this was. The witch. The ancient entity that had laid the curse. The witch turned, sensing her presence. Her face was a nightmare of ancient wrinkled skin and eyes that burned with a malevolent green light. She smiled, a lipless gash in her face. "Ah," she rasped, "the little catalyst, the spark that lit the fire. Or, in this case, brought the ice. You did my work for me, girl." Rage, hot and pure, surged through Alara. It was a force she had not felt in years, a righteous fury that burned away all fear, all doubt. This creature had tormented a line of good men, had condemned them to a lonely existence, and was now gloating over the final victim. "You will not have him," Alara snarled, the words torn from her throat. The witch cackled. "He is already mine, and you are nothing." A broken soldier playing at being a mother. Her green eyes flickered down to Alara's abdomen. "Oh, and with a little stowaway. How quaint. Don't worry. You will join your king in his frozen sleep soon enough." The witch raised her hand, and shadows coalesced around it, forming a jagged shard of black ice. She aimed it not at Alara, but at a corner of the room where a young serving girl was cowering, having come in to tend the fire and been trapped by the witch's arrival. The girl was no older than 12, her face a mask of terror. "Let's start with the help, shall we?" the witch sneered. She hurled the shard of ice. Time seemed to slow. Alara saw the shard fly. She saw the girl's wide, terrified eyes. She saw the frozen, dying king on the bed. and the rage inside her became a supernova. No, the word was a silent scream in her soul. She would not let another innocent be harmed. She would not let this monster win. Not here. Not now. She threw herself in front of the girl, her arms outstretched, her body a shield. She braced for the impact, for the killing cold. It never came. Instead, a wave of blistering heat erupted from her. It was a physical force, a concussive blast of warmth and light that originated in the core of her being. The air shimmered. The shard of black ice hissed and evaporated into steam a foot from her hand. The wave of heat rolled through the room. The ice on the walls melted, running down in streams. The frost on the floor vanished. The room, which had been a tomb, was suddenly warm. Alara stood there, panting, her hands glowing with a soft golden light. Fire. A living, breathing fire danced on her palms. It did not burn her skin. It felt like a part of her. A part that had been sleeping and was now awake. The witch stared, her jaw slack, her green eyes wide with disbelief. What are you? Alara looked down at her glowing hands, then at the terrified but unharmed girl behind her. She looked at the king, at the ice on his body that was now cracking and groaning under the assault of the sudden warmth. She didn't know what she was, but she knew what she had to do. I am his healer, Alara said, and her voice did not shake. It rang with a power she had never known she possessed. She raised her hands, and the golden light intensified, filling the room, pushing back the shadows. And I am his queen. The fire that poured from her was not a destructive force. It was the fire of life itself, the fire of a forge, the fire of a hearth, the fire of a mother's love. It was everything the curse was not. Impossible! The witch shrieked, shielding her face as the light grew brighter. No mortal has such power. You are wrong, Alara said, taking a step forward. The floor stones warmed beneath her bare feet. You built a prison of cold and loneliness, but you forgot something. You forgot that even in the deepest winter, there is the promise of a spark. She walked toward the bed, the golden light of her power flowing from her, a river of warmth. It washed over the witch, and the ancient creature screamed as the life-giving energy scoured her shadowy form. She dissolved, not in a blast of power, but like a mist burning off in the morning sun, her final, hate-filled shriek fading into nothing. Alara didn't spare the witch a second glance. Her focus was entirely on Kaelin. She reached the bed. The crystalline cocoon around him was fractured and melting, but he was still trapped, still deathly cold. Without hesitation, she placed her glowing hands on the ice over his heart. The contact was explosive. Not sound, but a silent detonation of energy. Her fire met the curse's ice. For a heart-stopping moment, they were at war, a battle of fundamental forces waged in the space of a man's chest. The ice fought back, sucking the heat from her, trying to extinguish her flame. But her fire was not just her own. It was fueled by a warrior's will, a healer's compassion, and the fierce, protective rage of a mother. It was fueled by the love she felt for this broken, lonely king. And it was fueled by the new life stirring within her. She pushed. She poured all of herself into him, all the warmth, all the life, all the hope she possessed. With a final, resounding crack that echoed in the soul rather than the ear, the ice shattered. It didn't melt. It sublimated, turning into a cloud of glittering, harmless vapor that filled the air for a moment before vanishing. Kaelin gasped, a huge, shuddering intake of breath, his back arching off the bed. Color flooded his face. The marble white receded, replaced by the healthy flush of a living man. The blue in his lips faded. He blinked, his eyes clear and sharp, the endless winter in them gone. He looked at her hands still resting on his chest, no longer glowing but still radiating a gentle warmth. Ilara, he breathed, his voice rough but strong. He reached up, his hand covering hers, His skin was warm. Tears streamed down her face, hot and real. She collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her strength finally giving out. "I thought I had killed you." "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He sat up, his movements sure and powerful, all trace of the curse's weakness gone. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his blessedly warm chest. "You saved me." She could feel his heart beating, a strong, steady rhythm against her ear. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. He held her at arm's length, his gaze searching her face. His eyes, no longer glacial, were the color of a summer sky over the sea. They were filled with a love so profound it stole her breath. "Your hands," he murmured, taking them in his. "The fire." "I don't understand it," she whispered. "I do," he said, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. It was like watching the sun rise after a lifetime of darkness. The old legends, they spoke of a queen of fire who would one day break the curse, a queen born of the sun, with life in her hands and in her womb. His eyes dropped to her abdomen, and his expression softened into one of awe. "I am not the only one you saved tonight, am I?" The secret was out. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He didn't ask whose it was. He didn't care. He simply placed a large, gentle hand over her stomach, his touch reverent. "A child of the Isles," he said softly. "The first in generations to be born free, born of a queen who chose us." They were found that way hours later by a frantic Fenrir, who burst into the room to find his master not dead, but very much alive, holding his midwife in his arms. The great wolf stopped, took in the scene, and let out a soft whine of pure, unadulterated joy before settling by the bed, his long vigil finally over. The months that followed were a whirlwind. The story of what had happened in the king's chambers became the stuff of legend overnight. The midwife who was a fire queen, the breaking of the ancient curse, the king's seat, once a place of cold and fear, began to thaw. Alara's past was laid bare, but no one cared that she had been a soldier, a fugitive. They only saw the woman who had saved their king and their kingdom. She was not judged. She was revered. Kaelin proclaimed her his queen in front of the entire court. There was no ceremony, no pomp. He simply walked to her side, took her hand, and said, "I was addressing my future queen. Anyone who objects can take their concerns to my dungeons." No one objected. She finally felt like she belonged. The empty spaces inside her, carved out by loss and loneliness, began to fill. She had a home, a pack, a man who loved her not in spite of her broken pieces, but because of them. He understood her darkness because he had lived in his own for so long. 6 months later, under a sky as blue as her husband's eyes, Alara stood on a balcony overlooking the sea. The salt spray was no longer cold, it was refreshing. The wind was no longer a threat. It was a caress. Kaelin came to stand behind her, wrapping his strong, warm arms around her. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand settling on the swell of her belly. "He's quiet today," he murmured against her ear. Alara corrected gently, "and she is just resting, biding her time." She smiled, leaning back into his solid warmth. "She has her father's patience." "And her mother's fire," he added, his voice filled with love. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun set, painting the clouds in hues of orange and gold. The kingdom was safe. The curse was broken. A new life was on the way. It was not a perfect world. There would be other battles, other storms. But for the first time in either of their lives, they would not face them alone. The warrior and the king, the midwife and the man, had healed each other. They had found their warmth in the heart of winter, and that was more than enough.